Hello once again everyone, another week, another video. So last time we discussed the guard of Ox. Now we're going to be going over its inverted cousin, Phlug. So, when it comes to Phlug, there really aren't a ton of variations. It's a relatively, not quite universal guard, but pretty self-explanatory. Arms are low, point is forward. It's hard to feel much safer than this. Now, when it comes to forming your Phlug, you have two different sides of it, of course. You have your right side, you have your left side, and their properties will change depending upon which one you're taking, just like with Ox, though a little bit finer points in regards to the two different Phlugs, because Ox, end of the day, my guard is high. Right? Sometimes it's a little bit more exposed, but overall, they pretty much do the same thing. With Phlug, though, things can change a little bit. So, first and foremost, let's form a good Phlug. Make sure that your legs are nice and your stance is wide, you're balanced, and you want to make sure, probably the biggest thing that people make the mistake of doing is they don't have their cross guard going at a 45-degree angle away from the body. You will oftentimes see wrists curling in, sometimes the thumb is up on the blade, causing a twist, something along those lines. What this causes is it causes that sort of shape. Now, the arms are not as protected as they should be, and if anything comes in here, I'll be meeting it not with the edge ideally where I want it. I'd be meeting it kind of with the flat or on the corner, which we've talked about before is not grand. The other reason is that if I go to move out anywhere, it's not quite aligned the same way I want it with my skeletal structure, so it's not going to have the same power, especially when it comes to the offsets, which is kind of Phlug's main thing. So, just like with Ox, make sure that the cross guard is going out at a 45-degree angle. Also make sure that your arms are off to one side and not in the middle. It's not that this guard doesn't exist. It does, of course, exist in other styles of fighting, looking very similar to Judon. But the thing to remember about it is that's not what Phlug is trying to do. Phlug is chambering on one side. Also, it is defending one side. As opposed to being sling central and extended, it is a little bit more reserved. Even if my arms are out, I'm not in at long point at the moment. I'm here in Phlug. Now, sometimes you will see some variations on right Phlug. The biggest variation you're going to see is going to be the arms withdrawn up into the body, or sometimes even they'll be pulled back slightly. Now, this is more prevalent in the older drawings. By Meyer's time, you will occasionally still see them curled up, but usually they're out. It doesn't change a whole lot, it just adds some time in between you being fully extended. So in some regards, this is a little bit more of a rested position because it's essentially resting on me. It also does, we've played around with it, and when sparring in armor, if you take Phlug, which you may very well need to do, especially if you are using the sword grip in general, or if you're fighting against lighter armored opponents, the palm is not that difficult to thrust into, so a little bit of a pet theory is that withdrawing the arms does protect it, very similar to how many of Fiore's posta are more withdrawn, giving a bigger opening here and a smaller opening on what would normally be the nearest target. Now, when it comes to should you withdraw the arms in your Phlug, it's kind of up to you. It is certainly canonical. You'll see it here, you'll see it here, you'll also sometimes see it pulled back. The biggest thing to be aware of is time and structure. If my arms are curled up, that means to do something, I have to extend them, which is taking time. Versus if they're already extended, I don't have to do that. So, depends. I personally prefer to stick with the arms out because that's what I was trained to do. Now, besides that, you're not going to see a ton of variation on the right side because there isn't a ton of variation to really do. The only other thing that I would say is a mistake that a lot of people make when it comes to the right side is if you curl your arms up, be sure that your posture is still erect and your body is back. And this, I'll talk about this eventually when I get to doing the Warden and For Honor, but a lot of times when people curl up their arms, they have the tendency to lean their head forward, which if you notice, my head is not that far away from the tip of my sword, which is not necessarily the strongest thing in the world, which means that my head is much closer to getting hit. Don't do that. Keep your posture erect so that way if someone cuts in, you can extend out and deal with what they're sending at you. If my head is leaned forward and I'm curled up like this, all I'm guaranteeing that I'm going to do is my brain is going to go, oh no, as I get hit, which is not a great way to end that particular bout. On the left side, however, we have some other properties we need to discuss. So when it comes to left Phlug, you will see it held a lot more often. Just like with right ox versus left ox, many people do not like crossing up their hands, either through personal preference, through lizard brain, or because their gear doesn't allow them to do so as easily. Now, left Phlug especially is a position that the little voice in the back of our head really likes. And it makes complete sense. We're standing, most people are right-handed, so you're standing with your dominant side forward. Your arms are uncrossed, which means you can extend them very naturally. This is not sapping my energy in the slightest. And the pointy bit is between me and my opponent. What's not to love? However, if you stand in left Phlug, you are limiting yourself quite a lot. And this is where you start to see what I have referred to as the HEMA sport fencing posture, or just, HEMA sport fencing in general. And that's not meant to be a takedown or anything of that of people who do it. I have used the position before. It works. There's no denying. Someone who is a good fencer, who is standing like this against fencers who are not as skilled as he or she, will win. It just comes down to it's a tool being used by the better person. However, especially for beginners, I advocate against it, because there's a whole lot of other stuff to learn that if you don't know, then this position's not doing as much for you, no matter how safe it makes you feel. So, let's go over some advice when it comes to left Phlug. Number one, make sure your arms are not fully out. If your arms are fully out, you're not really in Phlug anymore, you're in long arm. So we won't worry about that. But your arms should be about here. You can once again withdraw them, and there's even a depiction where the arms are basically back behind the person. I'm not sure why. This doesn't feel particularly comfortable. Maybe it is meant to indicate a lot more force being put into it, which if you're stabbing through mail or something along those lines, or just really hate the guy, yeah, sure. But either way, usually the pommel's gonna be level with my body. And once again, 45-degree angle off to my left now. Make sure the pommel's lined up with my hip, not in the middle. Now, the biggest thing to be aware of when it comes to this side is that modification-wise, really the biggest thing you'll see is whether or not you can put the thumb on the blade. Now, on this side, doing that is not a great idea. I mean, I can, and if I put my thumb on the blade on this side, I often find I curl my arms up more, so maybe that's why this position is being seen, but I digress. On this side, putting my thumb on the blade is not as terrible of an idea anymore, because from here, this is basically my naturally extended position. So anytime I finish anything, I'm going to end up out here, being a right side dominant fencer. So if I do, for example, a shield or any sort of short edge cut, I'm going to end up essentially in Phlug, but with the thumb grip. So some people have found it quite easy to remain in the thumb grip, which allows them to launch thumb grip type actions, especially like Untersverks, short edge cuts, which have the property of reaching over things quite easily. Taking off with Zverks on this side, all that grand stuff by just hanging out here. Now, the big drawback of doing that is that, once again, your hand is not very protected. Especially if you raise up at all, very easy to hit that or to hit your lead arm. So be aware of that. Number two is that you've got the flat of the blade exposed to them. So if they're cutting it this side, you're going to need to make sure to put either your long edge or your short edge actively against them. Because if they hit that flat, you don't have the power to prevent them from stopping you. Well, most of you probably don't. There are the occasional people that can get away with things like that. So, is it something you can do? Absolutely. Is it the only thing you should do? No. And then pretty much all the other stuff still applies. Don't lean your head forward, etc. In general, when it comes to using left Phlug, what I really recommend you use it for is either someone is cutting low on this side, in which case you're jamming the motion, which is another great reason to be good at your right Phlug, because if someone takes off low, your best bet is to step up and jam it by having a good, solid right Phlug. The other thing that left Phlug will be used for is usually anytime you launch into an action, and then your most natural withdrawing is just down into left Phlug, which is great if, for example, I launch something at my opponent, something happens, I decide to pull back, left Phlug is very natural, I can flow into whatever I want to flow into. Now, one more downside of Phlug in general that I want to go over, and another reason I don't advocate standing like this all the time. Remember, it's a point forward guard. What are point forward guards good at? They're good at thrusting. Which means that if my point is forward, regardless if I'm in right Phlug or left Phlug, if I wish to launch a cut, I have to pull the tip back. Even a little bit. Even, for example, at the moment I can do a very just sort of extending cut. Will that cut through to Tommy Matt? No. Would it cut flesh? Maybe, right? Especially if I can flick someone, somewhere important, who knows? But you'll notice, even if I do that, I still have to do that tiny little preparation. If I want to do an actual cut that I'm pretty sure would finish someone, I'm going to need to almost fold entirely back into Vom Tag. So, what that means is you're leaving a tempo through which can be exposed. Now, you can disguise this preparation with enough practice, right? You can channel it with your motions, so that's harder to see. You can, use other sorts of body feints or condition your opponent to not react to that. That's all plausible. But a savvy fencer will notice if you are standing in an extended guard and you are someone who mostly cuts, they're gonna see that pullback and they're going to take that tempo. It's called a Nachreißen, which means following after or chasing after, and is really something you've got to be aware of if you're going to stand in extended guards. So, if you're fencing Phlug and you see that the person likes to cut at you a lot, look for that, fill that gap. Of course, guard yourself against whatever their most likely response afterwards is, but fill that gap and you'll get a lot of really good hits that way. So, what can Phlug do for you if it's a little bit slow on the cut and it's a good defensive posture and it's really great for smothering? What else can Phlug do? Well, Phlug's biggest trick is without a doubt the Absetzen. Oh, this guy's great. So, against any sort of cut, especially coming from the opponent's right side, and I am in right Phlug, I just quite literally set aside whatever they're throwing at me. I use the tip to guide it off to the side, chamber it, boom, I can follow through with a very strong thrust. I can also catch cuts by going from Phlug to Ox. That works on both sides, though as a note, if you are in left Phlug, the Absetzen is not going to be as strong. So bear that in mind. It is better on your dominant side, like most of our stuff. Now, Absetzen is honestly fantastic and should be a key tool in your inventory as soon as you can get it. Because even when it comes to the one thing that beats Phlug, or canonically beats Phlug, which is a Schielhau, a good Absetzen will demolish even an average Schielhau. So seriously, get that guy in your toolbox as soon as you can. But the other great thing that Phlug can do for you is it is a wonderfully aggressive defensive posture. So we talked about how with Vom Tag, I can move around, I can be very deceptive, I can do a lot of things. Ox, a little bit more stagnant, not the most mobile thing. Phlug, on the other hand, cuts the difference between the two. With Phlug, I'm very safe. I feel very confident getting closer to someone because I have that tip out there. And as long as I'm keeping it moving and not letting it get grabbed, because people will do that, we'll talk about that more in long points video, but as long as I'm being active with it, I can be quite deceptive as to which side I'm going to use, and I can get relatively close to my opponent while presenting a threat. So, if you're looking for a guard that's going to kind of serve you like Vom Tag, Phlug is your best bet. And it's also very energy non-dependent. This does not drain me in the slightest to hold this guard, because tips forward, all the weight's balanced out that way, it's no problem. So, all that is to say, that's Phlug, basically. There aren't a ton of variations of it, so I don't really have to go over anything else. Some other guards do Phlug-like things, or things you can also do from Phlug, but most of them look more like Albers, so I'll be going over that next week. That one's probably going to be a pretty long video. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and we'll go over some other cuts, techniques, and guards another time.